Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamerTech.com video, we're going to be discussing more on the next generation of systems and consoles in general, and how the manufacturers of these consoles go with the hardware they do. And this is to answer a few questions that I've recently been having, as in, why are consoles always so far behind PCs in technology, and just generally speaking, not up to scratch in terms of the latest technology. Now, while I've kind of gone over this ground before, I do want to go over it again in much more detail, and also to kind of cover new angles. Now, there are a number of reasons that manufacturers choose the hardware they do, and these come down to cost, performance, ease of programming, the amount that they can get. In other words, for example, how many CPUs could be manufactured in a time period, that type of thing. Now, there's a reason, of course, that manufacturers cannot go with the latest technology at all times, and it's very simple. When a console is being first initially designed, it takes quite a while for them to really solidify and select what components go into it. An example of this would be that if they start to randomly throw components in at the last minute, they can be haphazardly integrated into the design. I'll use the Saturn for example. Now, the Saturn, of course, is a very infamous console released by Sega, and marked as one of the biggest failures of Sega. Now, which is a shame, because it was a very good console. Now, the Saturn itself was originally designed as primarily a 2D machine with 3D capabilities. But as it turns out, when Sega first looked at Sony's design, or got on wind of Sony's design for the original PlayStation, they realized that the market wanted to go towards 3D, and so they threw in an extra CPU and VDP, which are the video processing display, and as it turns out, it was a bit of a mistake. There are a couple of reasons for this. Sega's design really should have been postponed some. They made a massive error. The Saturn itself was very, very powerful for 2D, and titles like Guardian Heroes ran amazingly on it. But 3D was a bit of a problem, and programming for the unit was a bit of a problem as well. This is basically because the CPUs were, you had to design code which ran in parallel for both CPUs. And as it turns out, the programming tools that Sega released at the time were iffy. Let's go with that. So some developers, for example, when they were developing Alien Trilogy on the machine, only utilized one CPU, and the problem was even more compounded when developers realized that you could only access one slot of RAM. I'm sorry, not slot of RAM, and memory registers at the same time. So in other words, processor A was accessing it, processor B had to wait. This meant that effectively the second processor, or the one that was waiting for the data from the RAM, had to access memory via cache, and each CPU had 4 kilobytes of cache. So effectively you had to deal with the parallel processing, in other words more than one CPU, and the fact of this memory issue. Now, the N64 also had a bit of a problem with memory as well. The N64 was actually even more interesting in some ways than the Saturn. For a start, it went, of course, with the cartridge-based system, and moreover, the memory itself was integrated into the system as you'd expect. But the interesting thing is that the CPU could not access the memory independently. So, for example, it would have to first of all talk to the RCP, or reality coprocessor. The RCP handled two things. One would be the audio, one would be the video. And it would have to first of all go to that, then it would have to go to the memory. And this was a bit of an issue. This was even more of a problem because the RD-RAM in the system had very high latency at the time. So the system also had quite a iffy amount of bandwidth. It was only 250 megabytes per second. Now, why am I going to these old consoles? Because I want to illustrate the point. When you're designing a system, you need time to make sure that everything goes together. Now, in Sega's case, when they developed this stuff, it was at the last minute. In other words, they threw the components together, and you can't do that. You really need to make sure that everything works at a time. The problem with that is, as I say, time marches on. So let's say I'm developing a console now. I decide to scratch all the details out and say, hey, I want this amount of RAM, this amount of CPU power, this amount of GPU power. I strike the deals with AMD or whomever else, done. And then, let's say 2 years down the line, I'm just about to enter production phase and a new range of CPUs and GPUs are released that absolutely massacre the ones that I chose. Let's say they're twice as powerful, 3 times as powerful. Well, you can't do much about that. You can either go back to the drawing board, or you can delay the release of your system, or you can integrate them somehow or another and hope for the best that it all works. And the system's probably still going to have a weak point anyway, or you could just go ahead and release it, and most of the time they go ahead and release it. So a few people have been kind of annoyed or really curious about why Nvidia have said that the systems are equal to low to mid-range PCs, and that's one of the reasons. You can't constantly update the specifications of a system that's in launch, because at some point or another you just have to bite the bullet. It's like upgrading your PC, for another example. Let's say you upgrade your PC today. In a year's time, something better is going to be along, and that's just a given. The difference with a PC is if your CPU is a bit old or your GPU is a bit old, you can say, hey, you know what, I want to upgrade this GPU, and you can fling the other one on eBay, buy the other one, done. And you can actually do what's known as the graphics card shuffle in some circles. So if you manage to buy a cheap GPU, I'm not going to bother to mention a label, let's just say a cheap one that's just about good enough to do the tasks you want. It's even better if you have an IGU integrated GPU. You could sell the old one about, say, 6-7 weeks before the new ones are due to arrive, maybe even a month, and people who buy it on eBay, and then you get pretty much 3/4 or whatever of the price of the card you paid for. New one's released, you buy the new one, sweet. It doesn't cost you that much to upgrade. It's very similar to the mobile phone philosophy that a lot of people do anyway. Regardless, so that's one of the reasons that they choose the parts that they choose. It's pretty much through lack of choice and to make sure everything is compatible. So the second question I get asked a lot is, well, why don't they just go with the absolute best stuff available? And that's actually pretty easy to answer as well, but it's a multi-pronged answer. The first is cost. Let's say, for example, you were to go on Amazon. Feel free to pause the video for a second and take a look at something like the 7970 from, of course, AMD, or the GTX 680. If you don't have to, you'll know the price is, well, expensive. You're roughly going to be looking at the price of a PS4 just by itself with the GTX 680. Now, obviously the PS4's price is not confirmed and blah blah blah, but you get the idea. Regardless of the price, the point being, if you were to put one of those in, or even more, an SLI rig, it becomes extremely expensive, and most people are just not willing to spend, 600, 800, 1,000 on the new console. It's just not really going to happen in the marketplace, and your competitors will murder you simply because the system is cheaper and easier to get hold of. The second is down to yields and confidence in the manufacturing process. By the way, guys, I know my voice is a bit odd today. I've got a bit of a cold and sore throat, so I'm trying to do the best I can, but if I'm a bit hard to understand, I can only apologise. Not much I can do, I'm afraid. Let's talk for a moment about the Pentium 4. Now, the Pentium 4 is based upon what is known as the net burst architecture, and it's very cool actually, because it's one of the, well, it was the first home CPU, in other words the one that you could get easily, that was a virtual processor, in other words hyperthreading. Hyperthreading was by no means new, but for the most part, for most home consumers, it was the first CPU that really handled that. So it basically worked. I'm not actually going to thinking about it, it's probably pointless to go into the architecture of the P4, but what is the most important part of it is that originally when it was being released, Intel decided that, hey, well, at least thought that the CPU architecture would be able to go all the way through revisions, of course, all the way up to about 10 gigahertz. And as it turns out, this was not possible, and I believe the highest they got is like 3.8, Now you can overclock it heavily. I believe some people go it to like 6 gigahertz or whatever with really interesting cooling. That would be water cooling or above, and by above I mean like liquid nitrogen, that type of thing. But generally speaking, in most environments, that's not really possible. For example, Dell cannot, give away a massive water pump and reservoir and whatever else for its system. It's just not really going to work. So, if we were to take a look at the original Xbox One, just for a moment, you'll notice that the CPU is a variation of one that was a Pentium 3, actually. It's kind of cross between the Celeron and Pentium 3. But if you look at the date of release of the Xbox, you'll notice that it kind of coincides with the release date of the Pentium 4, and a year before that as well, AMD released their range of AMD Athlon XPs. XP, by the way, stands for Extreme Performance, I believe. And that CPU is obviously far in a way more powerful than the one that's in the Xbox One. But it just wasn't really possible for them to put that into the system. So if we fast forward a little bit and we talk about now, in terms of, say, the PS4 and Xbox 720, the Xbox 720 and PS4 we definitely know are, of course, using Radeon GPU from, of course, AMD. And that Radeon is based on the 7970M, and the 7970M is of course part of the 7000 series of AMD, and the 7000 series of AMD is a Southern Island GPU. Now, Southern Island GPUs are based on a 28nm, that's a manufacturing process, and the Southern Island GPU was reportedly taped out in February of 2011, so that's about 2 years ago. And AMD gave a preview of the new design of the Fusion development system. This is more of APUs and so on that, of course, Sony are using, because APU pretty much has the GPU and the CPU on the same die, or kind of anyway. Anyway, in 2011, July 21st, the company confirmed it is working on the silicon in-house, and it planned to release the first cards before the end of the year. However, that didn't happen. It was actually slightly delayed, and so eventually was released in the first quarter of 2012. Now, obviously, if you're Sony, you knew about this because you were shopping around, and they probably got some NDAs waved in their face, non-disclosure agreements, and those non-disclosure agreements said, hey, this is what we're working on, what do you want? Because obviously they would want the latest technology at the time for the deals, and they would have talked to AMD, and although obviously I wasn't there at the conversation, I really wish I was rather, but they would have said something like, hey, what can you guys offer us? And Nvidia also talked to them, by the way. Nvidia have said as much in the interview, by the way, about the PS4 performance. According to Nvidia, they actually said, yeah, we were in talks, and they couldn't iron anything out. Now remember, Nvidia did supply the GPU for the PS3. Now, according to Nvidia, they weren't interested in design, or couldn't come up with something at the price point that Sony wanted to pay. Remember, the console manufacturers, they want to do it as cheaply as possible. In other words, bottom dollar for the best performance / ease of use. So as it turns out, you've got this GPU. Now, eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that the 7970 in the PS4 is using notably less GPU cores, or sorry, GCN cores, graphics card next cores if you prefer, which of course were introduced with the 7000 series. And the desktop version, I'm putting myself on the spot here, I'm not looking on Google, I believe is 32, and I believe is running at 925 megahertz, and the laptop version is not. It's using only 20 GCN cores, and it's running a noticeably less in terms of the megahertz as well. I believe it's 850, but this is from pure memory. So why did they go with 18? That's almost half the number of the full desktop. There's a couple of reasons for this. They're fairly simple, actually. One is power. utilization. Now, I've mentioned this one numerous times before. It's not anything particularly exciting. It's just a case of when you're designing something, you need to make sure that it doesn't use too much power. See the Xbox 360 as an example, which is another example of heat. The thing is, with this device, it's an APU. In other words, it's using pretty much the same die to cool down. And to cool down a chip, you can only use a certain amount of cooling for a console. You cannot strap, liquid nitrogen tanks to this thing. You cannot, pretty much be using it as a space shuttle. It has to be portable, because if little Jimmy wants to take it to his friend's Robbie's house, he cannot risk water falling everywhere from a water leak. It just doesn't work. It has to be quite sensible. Moreover, as well, even if we were to talk about the original N64, now N64 had a very nice CPU on it. The N64 CPU is the NEC VR4300, and that is actually a cost-reduced derivative of the 64-bit version of technology of the R4300i, and that's built by NEC on a 35nm process. Now, that had quite a few changes to it, and was only rated at 93.75 MHz, as according to the 100 that the system could actually be run on. And this is primarily due to the same reasons that I've been mentioning before. In other words, that they need to make sure that the system is capable of running that at sufficient quantities. In other words, there are a couple of reasons for this. A few people have messaged me, and great that they are. I appreciate the messages about why haven't AMD or are Sony going to be overclocking the CPU or clocking the CPU at 2 GHz? Have the the current models been underclocked, what have you? And no, they're not. I mean, in my opinion, there is a chance, of course, they will be running at 2 GHz, but the likelihood is that there will be indeed 1.6, and there's a fairly good reason, solid reason behind this. And it is as follows. You're producing a piece of hardware, and you need to make sure that that hardware will run in sufficient quantities, that there's no errors, and that you can get it out to your consumers. For example, let's talk about the CPU. Now, the maximum speed that AMD Jaguars can run out so far are 2 GHz. Sony have gone a little bit under that. Sony have gone for 1.6 GHz. Which is roughly the margin of, lower speed or lower performance or whatever you want to say that you'd expect. After all, as I said before, you've got Nintendo who reduced theirs by, from 100 MHz to 93.75, and this is very consistent through most console manufacturers. The reason is to make sure that they've got good yields. For example, the 2 GHz part, it's a lot harder to produce. Let's say out of a silicon, let's say all the GPUs, CPUs and so on are made out of silicon, and let's say out of 100 you could have a certain percentage of those fail. It's that simple. I'm not saying 100 will always fail, I'm just using this as an arbitrary number. So let's say, for example, that you have out of 100, let's say 5 of those fail at 1600 megahertz. On the other hand, let's say at 2 gigahertz, that's 2000 megahertz of course, that let's go with 12 fail. So while that might not sound a massive failure rate, hell, it could even be 7. If you're struggling to get your system out for launch, this is a massive problem. This also produces another 2 problems. One, that your chip is more likely to fail later on, therefore you have to return it. Now, Xbox 360 crashed and burned with the RROD, Red Ring of Death, because of a couple of reasons. One, that their system ran very hot and the cooling on it was a bit dodgy. The second was that Microsoft kind of cut corners, especially with the X-clamp, and that basically meant that the system became extremely hot, and it made the solder, depending how you wish to pronounce it, off the board to become a bit crap over time. And there were ways around it that you could fix yourself, but that's, most people of course didn't do that. Most people resorted to either sending the machine back to Microsoft pretty angrily, or the second option was that they bought a new system. So No manufacturer really wants that. It's bad for business. It's also bad for business if, let's say, they can only ship 50,000 units to the United States for Christmas. That's just not good for business even any way, shape or form, because obviously that hurts their image with the consumers, that hurts their image with themselves, that hurts their even their share prices. It just doesn't do well. There's what's known as paper launch in the computer industry. Paper launch is basically that there are very, very few of the units made, and the big review sites, so that would be something like BitTech, for example, they would get a version of that GPU. Now, it would be their own GPU. In other words, it would be AMD or, for example, Nvidia or Intel, whomever produced the stuff, and they would say, hey, this is a very limited quantity, have a look at it. And the reason it's limited quantity is because they've not got the manufacturing process up to scratch yet. It might be that it was running a bit behind schedule or what have you, or they had some problems, but they still managed to get it out on time. There are numerous reasons for this, I'm just giving you one. They managed to get it out on time, but generally speaking, it's not a proper launch, it's a paper launch. And X800, we're going back a few years now, of course, this is back in the day of AGP, rather than PCIe, was a fantastic example of a paper launch. Nvidia are guilty of it as well, by the way. It basically is that very few people could get hold of the system, and of course the price went all the way up through the roof because people wanted the damn thing but no one could, and so it wasn't really good for anyone, including of course Nvidia or AMD, whomever produced the item. So generally speaking, it's very difficult. So does that mean that consoles are doomed? No, of course not. People just assume that consoles, are always going to be the cutting edge technology, and in reality they're not. In reality, however, they're extremely important for PCs because, quite simply put, they are where a lot of the money is, and they are also where a lot of development is. Like it or not, if you're a console fan and you hate them or whatever, consoles are very important and very lucrative to everyone involved, including EA and whomever else. The other great thing from the perspective of a PC owner is that these new range of hardware from Sony and from Microsoft is going to be a significant jump from what we've already got. Now, how much of a jump? It depends on what part of the system you're talking about, and also how you choose to measure. The measurements are very varied. You're looking at between 6 to 11 times as powerful, depending on what you're measuring, how you're measuring, and various other bits and bobs, and what systems of course you're measuring against. But suffice to say, even if you say it's 5 times more powerful, it's a lot of difference. I mean, the system has a crap ton more RAM, for example, 8 gigabytes versus 512, which is of course 16 times the amount of memory. But you are looking at, say, Blu-ray and whatever else, of course, which are going to fill that very quickly, especially with HD textures or high-quality textures. I really hate when people say HD textures, because, HD has been around for a long time. It's actually, as a side note, that consoles have been able to output in very high resolutions for quite a while. Even the original Xbox was able to output at 720p, just not to the degree. I believe Soul Calibur could have been. I believe Soul Calibur is one of the titles that could. PCs, of course, have been able to output in HD for a long time. It's just a very good marketing technique to say, hey, we can output in 720p or 1080p HD because that sounds really good for gaming. Reality, of course, we've been like that for a while now. Indeed, it's very little known, but even the Sega Saturn actually had the ability, although it wasn't never used, it was never implemented in terms of software or the hardware for it, in terms of the cabling and so on. But the Saturn actually had the ability to output in VGA, not in HD resolutions like, for example, 1080p, but it could do it. It's quite nice to know. So yeah, it's quite a bit of stuff actually in regards to that. The Dreamcast, for example, could output in progressive scan. It's just now, of course, that consoles are really starting to push that because HD TVs are really around, and therefore the consoles can really start to kind of flex their muscles. The problem is, of course, that consoles are a closed system. The problem is, from the manufacturer's point of view, that they're never ever going to be able to be on top of this. Valve, of course, with the Steam box, is making some progress. The problem is, and Sony have said this, Microsoft have said this, and Gabe said this to a degree, that they're not really concerned with one another because they don't really feel that they're going to encroach upon one another's markets. Whether that's true or not, it remains to be seen. Right now, they're not released. It's very difficult to really know that for certainty. And I have no doubt that, let's say I was to release, or they were to release it, there's always a chance, there is a chance that, it could somewhat impact it regardless. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this video. I think I've covered everything I want to, and no doubt I'll think of something I missed 2 minutes after I stopped recording. But for now, I think it's going to finish. I will be taking a look at old generation of systems as well, including the Saturn. I have an absolute ridiculous amount of stuff that I need to be doing in terms of technical analysis. But I wanted to get this video out because I know some people are really curious about some of the comments I've made, and others as well, in regards to the GPU performance. Obviously, Nvidia have said that, the PS4 is low to mid system. And they've also said that, of course, that with some glee might I add that the GTX 680, which is about 18 months old now, is about twice the performance in terms of raw computational power, that's G-flops and texture and so on, of the PS4. And it's actually quite funny that just before they announced that, I'd already done the analysis of the 7970 full version. I'd already done the calculations on the website, so I feel really happy and vindicated for myself there. So anyway, enough self-congratulations on my own part. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you around soon. Take care of yourselves, and have a wonderful day. Bye for now.